Well, thank you. Thank you very much. So this piece that I'll be reading various extracts from was originally written for the Hay Festival last May as part of their celebrations of the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. And as part of these celebrations, they asked various authors, what would you like to reform? And I looked about the world and I decided that I wanted to try to reform people like me. I wanted to reform men. Now, back then in May, when I would tell people that I was writing a piece about reforming masculinity, I got on the whole two responses. The first was an assumption that I was writing some kind of a men's rights manifesto, sort of a counter-argument to feminism, which is almost exactly what this isn't. I can assure you that now. The other response was also very intriguing. There was an assumption that I would be reaching back to somehow kind of recapture some element of masculinity to reform the emasculated contemporary man. And again, this is very much not what this piece is about. I hope this piece is very much about looking forward. I think my favourite response was when a woman said, oh yeah, I suppose you're quite an interesting person to talk about masculinity because, you know, you've played rugby, you've worked with soldiers, but you also do all that namby-pamby, arty-farty stuff as well. Which kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of the very prescriptive and the somewhat narrow definitions of masculinity that we have, that I think do an incredible amount of harm, not just to women, but also to men. So you can imagine, fast forward now since last May, and it's been extraordinary to witness how quickly thinking around what reforming masculinity might be has changed, and the extent to which the subject has, thank God, started to enter the mainstream conversation. And it has done so mostly, of course, around the awareness raising of some of the most damaging attitudes and practices that we've allowed to arise in our essentially patriarchal society. And of course, we must continue to do that. It's so important to keep on drawing focus to these practices and these attitudes to illustrate that these are choices of being. They are not just how things are. I also hope that over these last 6 months, what we're starting to see at long last is a broadening in the ownership of the problems. Ridiculously, for decades, the problems of some of the most harmful aspects of masculinity have always been seen to be owned by the victims, and that's mostly women. And I hope that over these last few months, when we've been talking more and more about sexual harassment and the gender pay gap, and various other forms of sexism, that men are starting to put their hands up and say that these are problems that are very much instigated by men. They are our problems. They are everyone's problems. What we perhaps haven't seen as much of yet is, alongside this conversation about what happens, which must still be out there in the general conversation, we haven't seen as much of a talk about how might we stop this happening? How might we engender a cultural shift so that the boys of now don't end up replicating these kind of behaviors? How might we start a movement where we begin to question that narrow definition of masculinity, which I think in various ways all of us have probably found ourselves contributing to in some way. And I hope it's as part of that discussion that this piece, which is a poem, the original poem was 30 minutes, this obviously will not be 30 minutes, I hope that it's in this area that this can make some sort of a contribution as a provocation, really, to keep this debate going, but also to talk about who else might benefit from the breaking down of the patriarchal society. And by that I mean, obviously women will benefit, but I think absolutely that also men will benefit. So these are a few extracts, so if there are any glaring holes in the argument, hopefully you'll find those addressed in the full version. If they're not, then it's just a glaring hole in the argument. It's addressed to my daughters as well. It's called The Men You'll Meet. So, my daughters, one recently born, the other still in the womb, why is it when asked what I'd like to reform, my first thought was to address that reform to you? Well, for me to reform means the future, how we might mould it with imagination into a better shape for all. Although I must admit, since I became your father, it's become more specific. For you, my children, my 2 girls who will grow into women. And maybe that's why when I cast a reforming eye about our world, our lives, viewing it through your bodies, your minds, I kept seeing at the root of so many of the ills that threaten you, injustice, violence, oppression, pollution, people like me, men. I looked harder and listened to, put my ear to how we are, what we do, try to discern the undercurrents of our nurture, the inherited habits and behaviors, which day by day it's so easy to forget are there. And when I did, I heard others who'd seen the same and who were already having this conversation of cause and concern about what we teach and learn when it comes to ideas of what it is to be a man. But I also saw that this talk was, in the scheme of things, new, still forming, a recent debate, despite the age of the issue. And it spread about our globe, which at first seemed odd. I mean, the discussion about what women might be, could be, has been running for generations. As a sex and a gender, they've looked forward, see, and in doing so unlocked the parts of themselves kept from them by society. But men, well, we've hardly been doing the same. The white male and his equivalent in other cultures have made their worlds to fit them, so they might reap its rewards most easily. What are considered to be masculine traits are prized more highly, advantages of life more accessible, their assumed superiority unquestioned in plain sight. So hey, why talk about what might be wrong or unhealthy about masculinity? If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? But maybe that's why those conversations I heard when I put my ear to how we are about men and who we might be have finally begun. Because our traditional ideas of being a man are just that, broken, outdated, unhelpful and harmful, and not just to women and the poor, but to everyone, including, I'd say, the majority of men. Which is why I hope I'd be standing here now saying the same if I didn't have daughters but sons, because regardless of sex, we need to talk, we really do for once, about what men might become. Take a lead from feminism and imagine what might they be and how might we as a species come someday to equate a more positive charge with masculinity. If we're going to make that progress, though, make no mistake, the personal and the global, the intimate and the universal are going to have to be addressed at once. How men are one-to-one with each other and with women and children, but also how the idea of a man sits across our cultures, religions, nations, because neither can happen alone. The personal informs the political, the domestic, the public, and vice versa, a spiral of influence that tightens over time. So it's that spiral we need to slow, unwind. The way what we teach about gender becomes who we are until it feels like nature, the normal, when really mostly it's not. It's nurture. Which is why this tightening spiral can be our solution too. What did Locke say? Man hands on misery to man, it deepens like an ocean shelf. Well, yes, but an ocean shelf slopes the other way too. And we have to believe that instead of a deepening, a shallowing of inherited pain is also in our power. That what we pass on is what we become, for good as well as bad. Otherwise, how else is progress made? American social scientists in the 1970s came up with 4 rules of Western masculinity. No sissy stuff, be a big wheel, a sturdy oak, and give 'em hell. Now, 5 decades on, for most of the globe, these markers haven't moved, which is pretty crap. I mean, I don't want the men you'll meet to be restricted by these rules. I want them to be informed by and have more options than that. In fighting against discrimination over the same 5 decades, women have managed to move into more traditionally male roles, which, let me stress, has been only for the good. But where's the equivalent movement for boys? The encouragement to broaden the bandwidth of what it means to be a man, to study the arts, be a full-time father, to value communication over anger. There are groups, attempts on a local scale, but on a global, it isn't there. And as a result, the options of what being a girl can mean are much broader than those for a boy. Firstly, because of feminism, but also, it has to be said, because society still values the manly attributes the girls acquire over the feminine trait instead. For those who question that, ask them this, a scenario courtesy of Grayson Perry and his book, The Descent of Man. A 6-year-old girl with cropped hair walks down the street wearing jeans, waving a sword or a gun. What do you think? A tomboy, right? A little girl having fun. A 6-year-old boy walks just behind with long hair, wearing a skirt, waving a wand. What do you think? A sissy? A victim? I mean, don't his parents worry how they'll all have it in for him? So who's promoting this narrow definition of man? Well, just about everyone. Advertising, toy shops, fathers, brothers, films, games, our language, the internet, schools, sisters, mothers. Boys will be boys. When do we say that? Not when they've solved a problem or painted a picture or helped someone. More likely when they've been too rough, misbehaved, or maybe even cut back on their reading. Because it's easier that way, isn't it? To give in to the idea that gender is fixed, so all we can do is roll over and accept it. At which point, you may ask, why not? You've been banging on about this problem of men, Dad, but what exactly is it? Well, daughters, I think there's more than one issue, but as problems often are, they're linked, threaded within masculinity's narrow definition. But let's start with this. Imagine yourself an alien, fresh on the earth, and in one fluid glance you survey our world. This, in numbers, is part of what you see, just here, in this country. 90% of violent crime is committed by men. 75% of all crime the same. 95% of prison inmates, men again. 98% of sexual offences are committed by men. 45% of women have experienced domestic abuse, sexual assault, or stalking. In a survey where teenage girls and boys were asked which of all their fears was the greatest one, the girls' most common answer was being raped, assaulted, or killed. The boys being ridiculed, the subject of laughter. You cast your alien eyes wide across the globe. Every example of systemic oppression you find is designed and governed by men. The reckless despoiling of the planet, that too is dominated by them, as for that matter is the doubting of the consequences of the same. Violent extremism of every religion, Christian, Muslim, again, overwhelmingly stoked divides and crimes in its names committed by men. The greed-driven, overly risky financial models that crash, bringing austerity and ruin. Yep, you guessed it. The architects and cultures of these also rooted in traditional masculinity. By now, your alien jaw is on the floor. This is extraordinary. To call a spade, from what you can tell, nearly all this planet's wrong is done by 50% of the population. But then you realize at least the source is clear, and therefore also the solution. Surely you think, opening up your single alien ear, this must be the talk on everyone's lips. Look at all this harm the men have done, but at least we now know it's done by them. So hooray, we can roll up our sleeves and sort this thing. You listen. Nothing. A few whispers on the wind, the odd lone voice. But on the whole, the talk around issues of identity seems to be about mostly others instead. Women, as we've already said, minorities and races, sexualities, but men in the shape of those who have shaped our world. The figures are there, plain to see, as are they, but the debate to tackle them, strangely empty. You raise your alien eyebrows in surprise. Maybe I've missed something, you surmise. So you look again, but what you see just confuses you more, because this issue of men, it seems, is hurting them too, whether rich or poor. So violence, for example, it's now clear to you, is a male disease, but its victims are men as well as their female partners, daughters and wives. In the UK, you learn, men are 80% of the victims of violent attack and 85% of those committing suicide. And that, a death by their own hand, is the single biggest killer of males under 45. You stop to take that in. Surely that, if nothing else, is a canary in the mine. But it doesn't stop there, because men, you see, despite undoubtedly reaping the advantages of a male biased system in wages, opportunities, power, and authority, are still, beyond violence, being hurt by masculinity. 80% of rough sleepers are men, for one. And here's another, 4 times more likely as boys to suffer with difficulties of behavior or emotion, and 3 times more likely to be excluded from school. Then on the more granular level that's harder to measure, the way a constrained vision of masculinity can be detrimental to their happiness and well-being, and of course their relationships with women. Long hours in the office, short hours with the family, increased loneliness, fewer close friends, a decline in the jobs that once gave them identity. And for me, that goes to the matter's heart. If the view of your gender you inherit is narrow and built on myths from an age not yours, when it doesn't work out and you're left with no power, status, authority, all of which you've been told is what makes you you, what do you fall back on? Options is what you need, another way to be, to navigate your recovery. And for traditional man, as prescribed as he is, they're few. Okay, the alien is off now, time to go. But we, my children, we're still here. We can't just observe then run. I mean, the boys of now and the future are the men you'll meet, so I'm guessing you'd like something done. All well and good, Dad, being so down on the state of men, but if it's really so bad and you're so smart, then what's your solution? Good question. Well, for starters, have the conversation. And not just the what, how we talk about it. That in itself would be a great leap forward. Be inquiring, ambitious, aware of what gender is and is doing for all, and where we have it too. At festivals and in the media, yes, but also in soaps, pubs, films, and most importantly, I'd say, in school classrooms and halls. So maybe statutory lessons for boys and girls about what's expected of them as men and women and why that's the case and should it be. Let them discuss those stats I shared with you and see how they'd imagine a different way forward. Let them talk it through, not just in terms of what's gone wrong, but also the benefits, rewards. And here's another thing that has to happen. Absolute equality. At home, work, across society. Why? Well, if boys see and experience patriarchy, if they observe an assumed male superiority, then we can't even get out of the starting blocks, because this is part of the narrow bandwidth. If men are dominant, then with that comes a shopping list of other constrictive traits, being the provider, power, authority, sexism, a reliance on certainty, strength. As the anthropologist Margaret Mead once said, every time we liberate a woman, we liberate a man. And I'd say the opposite of that is true as well. Because if we do, hopefully men will see there's nothing to fear. Equality isn't a zero-sum game. It's not a seesaw. When one goes up, the other goes down. No, it's balance. Holding that seesaw in buoyant space, alive with possibility, not anchored at one end and suspended at the other. But what I hear you say about us, the children, when we come along, men and women become father and mother, doesn't that put a spanner in the equality works? Well, yes, it always has done, but it doesn't have to. If we want a better society, then it's in our power to shape it. The ocean shelf slopes up as well, remember. So to start with, subsidized and universal childcare across the board for all preschool children and paid equal parental leave. Being involved as a dad needs to become the norm, the choice of who cares and how much made within each family, not by society. For this to happen, men need to not just be invited to take their leave, adopt flexible hours, but also expected. How does that happen? Well, apart from changing the culture of work to adopt this, also in stressing the benefits. I mean, it's a win-win situation. The children experience and see men in a caring role, and while it's been proved in the Nordic countries, where this is already on the move, the men are happier, more socially connected, more emotionally stable, and they feel they can exchange the stress from above of putting food on the table, for caring for their children, for providing for them not just with money, but also time, emotion, and love. Okay, I'm going to bring this to a close now, but before I go, a couple more ambitious ideas. I mean, what's the point of imagining reform if you don't let yourself dream? So here's one, the degendering of personality traits. What would it be like if we stopped identifying aggression with men, emotions and communication with women? To do away with the idea of girls' jobs and boys' jobs, thank you, Mrs. May, and to say to our children, follow your instincts, your wishes, your ideas, free from prescription or boundaries or fears. For the time being, though, in terms of men, how about we at least try expanding on the traits we traditionally associate with them? To protect and provide, for example. What if we were to man up on this one and extend our vision of what is provision, protection beyond our own tribe? To see it in terms of our species instead, until to do either in such a way that someone else is left unprotected or unprovided just isn't manly at all. If we follow this logic, then environmentalists, never usually spoken of in the most masculine terms, should be the gayest guys of all, protecting the whole planet. And in doing so, trying to provide for everyone. Wow, now that's a man, lifting his eyes from his own back door to take in the globe, to protect and provide for us all. So daughters, let's end on a vision of what men and masculinity might be by the time you're my age, 42, 43. A person with chromosomes of X and Y, for whom power without compassion is no power at all, for whom strength has been decoupled from domination, for whom to be fit, healthy means in body, mind, and emotion, for whom oppression is equated with fear in the oppressor, aggression with failure on the part of the aggressor, for whom the ability to be vulnerable makes him strong, as does that to be unsure, uncertain, even wrong. A male allowed to contain Whitman's multitudes, who has cared for and witnessed the growth of his children, or who, if he has none, is still involved as mentor or teacher with the next generation, because not to be would be, well, unmanly, who actually would no longer be familiar with that word, but would in its place have another for whatever not being a human might mean. I know, I dream. But as your father, that's part of my job. Every parent wants to pass on something better, and so far we're not doing so great. A property, a fair economy, the climate, I see it all slipping out of your grip. But if we could pass on this vision, or even just a taste of it, for you to later form, then that would be getting something done. To know that one day the two of you might read this, each with a man or a woman by your side, who'll look on in disbelief that it was ever necessary to give such a speech, who'll put their arms around you as you put yours around them, all of you beyond your sex, your own person, as you wonder how it was we could have been so mad, shaking your heads as you walk away, saying with a smile, each to the other, silly old dad. Thank you.